Alara Whitmore stood alone on the ridge of her family's land, the early morning sun barely peeking over the jagged desert horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the fields her ancestors had nurtured for generations. The stakes driven into the earth by the railroad company gleamed in the weak sunlight, cold and indifferent, marking the invasion of steel and progress into a landscape that had once breathed freedom and quiet prosperity. Each spike hammered into the soil felt like a personal attack, a challenge that whispered she was powerless, that her family's legacy, carved through decades of sweat and toil, would be erased under the relentless march of progress. She tugged at her worn leather gloves, knuckles whitening as she gripped the reins of her father's old horse, the leather creaking and groaning under her weight, and scanned the horizon for signs of the crews working deeper in the valley. The wind cut across the ridge with a sharpness that carried both dust and the faint metallic scent of the stakes, whipping her long auburn hair across her face and stinging her cheeks like tiny needles. She raised a hand to shield her eyes, squinting against the glare, and her heart tightened at the sight of surveyors moving with methodical precision, their boots stamping over the very soil that had sustained her family for generations. No one in the nearby town could be counted on. The men who had once pledged loyalty to her father had either sold their honor for a few pieces of silver or retreated into excuses that rang hollow against the roar of the hammering. Alone, she felt the weight of responsibility settle like a stone on her chest, pressing her down with the gravity of every promise her father had ever made to his own father, every hope that their lineage would endure. And yet, in the quiet spaces between the sound of the stakes and the creak of her horse's saddle, a fierce determination ignited within her, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. She had ridden this land since childhood, knew every hidden ravine, every ancient oak that twisted against the horizon, every curve of the river that cut through the valley like a silver thread. The land spoke to her in whispers and sighs, and she listened, learning its secrets, memorizing its paths. Knowledge was her weapon, and she intended to use it to outwit the crews that threatened to erase everything she loved. The sky, however, seemed to sense her defiance and responded in kind. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, swirling and thickening with a quiet menace, and the wind began to howl with growing intensity, as though the desert itself were warning her of dangers beyond the railroad's intrusion. The first streaks of lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the jagged cliffs and casting ghostly shadows on the valley floor, and she felt a shiver run down her spine, not from fear but from the raw, electric anticipation that something momentous was about to unfold. Her horse snorted nervously, stamping against the dirt as the air grew heavy with the scent of ozone and rain. She tightened her grip on the reins, her pulse hammering in her ears, and urged the horse forward, weaving through the rocky terrain with a mixture of instinct and intimate knowledge, barely avoiding the thin, treacherous gullies that threatened to trip both her and the animal. Every step was a negotiation with the land itself, every careful movement a testament to the bond she shared with the soil beneath her boots. Hours passed and the storm drew nearer, the wind carrying the scent of rain and the distant rumble of thunder that shook the canyon walls like the growl of some ancient creature. Disturbed by her intrusion, she shouted into the wind a declaration of defiance and a challenge, letting her voice echo through the cliffs and gullies, daring fate itself to oppose her. And yet, deep in the pit of her stomach, a tiny whisper of doubt nagged at her, a reminder that she was, after all, only human, fragile in the face of both nature's fury and the overwhelming power of the railroad company. The stakes, the surveyors, and the storm combined into a looming threat she could not fight with courage alone. Her horse stumbled over slick rocks and she barely caught herself, the reins biting into her palms, the animal snorting in alarm. She held her ground, drawing in a deep, steadying breath, letting the familiar rhythm of the land calm her racing heart. Every rustle of brush, every whisper of the wind felt alive, as if the earth itself were watching and waiting for her to prove her worth. And then, as the first heavy drops of rain began to spatter the dusty ground, cooling it with a sharp, biting chill, Alara made a silent vow to the land, to her ancestors, and to herself. She would protect this valley, these fields, and the legacy of her family at any cost. She did not yet know that destiny was riding toward her through the storm, a force she could not have anticipated, a presence that would test her courage, her resolve, and the very limits of her strength. Alone, she had endured the first trials of this day, but the coming tempest promised challenges that would demand more than bravery. It would demand trust, courage, and perhaps the most difficult lesson of all, the willingness to accept help from an unexpected hand, one that would arrive on a horse of midnight black, with eyes as sharp as the desert hawk and a presence that could bend even the fiercest storm to its will. And as lightning cracked across the sky and the valley trembled under the roar of distant thunder, Ilara spurred her horse forward, unaware that the events about to unfold would forever intertwine her fate with that of the storm-riding warrior whose arrival would change everything. The storm arrived with a suddenness that left Ilara's lungs burning, and her horse slipping on the slick, rain-soaked rocks, the sky darkening to a deep, menacing gray as wind tore through the canyon like a living, furious creature. Sheets of rain struck her face with relentless force, stinging her eyes and obscuring her vision, washing the valley floor into a blur of mud and shifting shadows. Lightning tore across the heavens, illuminating jagged cliffs and the twisted forms of desert trees, their gnarled limbs bending under the sheer power of the storm. Each thunderclap reverberated through the canyon walls with a force that made her chest ache, and for the first time that day, doubt seeped into her mind like cold water through a crack in stone. She had fought alone for so long, relied on her knowledge of the land and the grit instilled by her father, yet the storm made her feel as fragile as a single feather tossed into a hurricane. Her horse's hooves slipped repeatedly on the rain-slick rocks, threatening to send both of them tumbling into the deep ravines below, and she pressed her body close to its neck, whispering reassurances she could barely feel herself. Every instinct screamed that the land she loved might soon be lost, not to the hammering of the railroad stakes but to the raw, uncontrollable fury of nature itself. Her boots sank into the softening soil, and the wind's howl became a chorus of whispers urging her to turn back, to seek shelter. Yet she refused. She could not abandon her inheritance, could not allow decades of her family's toil to be swallowed by greed or disaster. And then, in the chaos of the storm, a figure appeared on the distant ridge, moving with the effortless grace of someone who belonged to this harsh, untamed land. At first, the torrential rain and swirling dust made it impossible to see clearly. But as the lightning illuminated the figure in brief, brilliant flashes, Ilara caught sight of a man riding a horse as black as the night, its coat shining wet under the storm's fury. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in garments that seemed almost impervious to the wind and rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, yet his eyes burned with a calm intensity that cut through the chaos. The horse moved with a precision that defied the slippery terrain, sliding over slick rocks and dodging hidden ravines with the ease of one intimately familiar with every inch of the canyon. Ilara's heart skipped a beat at the sight, a strange mixture of awe and caution tightening her chest. She had expected no help, had steeled herself to face the storm entirely alone, yet here was a presence that seemed both otherworldly and terrifyingly real, moving toward her like a shadow riding the wind. The figure's approach carried with it a sense of inevitability, as if the storm itself had chosen this moment to deliver him, and she felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. The man's eyes met hers briefly, and she was struck by their depth, dark, piercing, and wise, as though he could see not only her physical struggle, but the fierce determination and the vulnerabilities she had spent years hiding. He reined his horse to a halt a few yards away, water dripping from the animal's flanks, and spoke without raising his voice above the storm, his tone steady, commanding, yet somehow gentle. "You cannot face this alone. Let me help." His words, simple as they were, carried a weight of authority and understanding that startled her, and despite her stubbornness, a flicker of relief sparked within her. She had spent the day fending off threats from men driven by greed, but she had never imagined that the universe itself might send a savior, a warrior shaped by the land, by the wind and sun and rain, to stand beside her in the moment of greatest need. Ilara's mind raced, torn between caution and the desperate need for assistance. Yet before she could reply, a surge of lightning struck close by, illuminating the narrow canyon and showing her how precarious her position had become. Mud slid beneath her horse's hooves, threatening to pitch them into a jagged ravine, and the wind howled so loudly that it seemed to drown out even the voice of the approaching warrior. The stranger, however, navigated the terrain with a precision and familiarity she could only dream of, his horse gliding over rocks and rushing waters as though the storm were a mere illusion, not a deadly force. In an instant he was alongside her, his presence a shield against the merciless elements, and he extended a firm hand, steady and sure. His touch carried warmth and reassurance, cutting through the cold and the fear. grounding her in the reality that she was no longer completely alone. The storm raged around them, hammering the earth with rain and wind, yet in that brief, electrified moment, a fragile thread of trust began to weave between them. Fragile as the mist rising from the canyon floor, but unbroken and potent, a promise of protection, courage, and something deeper yet unspoken, waiting to reveal itself. As the thunder rolled and the valley flooded with the first heavy sheets of rain, Alara finally allowed herself a moment of acknowledgement, not of surrender but of alliance. She glanced at the warrior, at the calm determination etched into his features, and realized that this encounter was not mere chance. The storm, the danger, the railroad's encroachment, all of it had converged to this singular instant, forcing her to confront the limits of her own strength, and the possibility that she could trust someone else, even in a world that had so often demanded solitude and self-reliance. The warrior's presence was a lifeline, a bridge across the churning chaos, and as she adjusted her grip on the reins and prepared to navigate the treacherous canyon alongside him, a spark of hope ignited within her, a fragile, fierce promise that perhaps the land, her legacy, and her own spirit might yet endure, guided by the hand of a stranger whose courage rivaled her own. And in that moment, amid the torrent of rain and the clash of thunder, Alara understood that her fight was no longer hers alone. The destiny had delivered a companion shaped by the same land she loved, a force who could ride through storms, literal and metaphorical, to stand with her against the world. The rain fell harder now, hammering against the canyon with a deafening roar, turning the narrow trails into slick, treacherous paths of mud and loose stone. Yet the warrior moved beside Alara with an ease that seemed almost supernatural, his horse dancing along the jagged rocks with uncanny precision. She struggled to keep pace, her muscles aching from hours of riding through the storm. But his presence lent her a courage she hadn't realized she needed, steadying her nerves and sharpening her instincts. Together they rode along the ridges and gullies, scanning the valley below where the railroad crews had begun to make deeper incisions into her land. The men had brought heavy equipment, and though the wind and rain had slowed their progress, the sound of axes striking wood and hammers driving stakes reached their ears like a grim reminder that the threat was still real. Alara shouted commands to the men from the distance, her voice barely carrying over the storm, but the warrior's calm, authoritative tone carried far more weight, and she realized with a mixture of relief and awe that he commanded presence not just from nature but from people as well. His dark eyes scanned the crews with the precision of a hawk, anticipating their every move, and he gestured to her, indicating a narrow pass that would allow them to flank the surveyors without exposing themselves to danger. She followed him, her heart pounding not just from fear but from exhilaration, the adrenaline sharpening every sense as they navigated the storm-tossed terrain. The wind whipped past their faces, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and the metallic tang of rain on steel. And lightning cracked again overhead, illuminating the valley below in stark momentary brilliance. Alara's pulse quickened as she saw the crews laboring blindly in the storm, unaware of the pair moving like shadows above them. The warrior leaned close as they rode, his voice low but firm, instructing her on which paths were safe, which rocks were loose, and when to spur her horse forward or hold back. She marveled at his intimate knowledge of the canyon, the way he seemed to merge with the landscape, each movement calculated yet fluid, as if the storm itself bent to his will. Every strike of thunder felt like a drumbeat in the rhythm of their mission, every flash of lightning a signal that their efforts were both urgent and necessary. They moved with precision and purpose, blocking paths and sabotaging stakes before the surveyors could secure them, leaving subtle traps and diversions that slowed the men's progress without endangering their lives. A delicate balance between strategy and survival that Alara had never imagined she could achieve alone. Yet with the warrior by her side, the impossible suddenly felt attainable, as if the land itself had provided its champion to aid her cause. Hours passed in a blur of rain, wind, and action, the storm's fury showing no sign of abating, but still they pressed on. Each narrow pass they traversed, each ridge they scaled, brought them closer not just to halting the railroad's progress, but to a growing understanding of each other's strength. Alara had always been fiercely independent, wary of trusting anyone fully. Yet the warrior's presence was different. It carried no expectation of submission, no demand for loyalty beyond the immediate moment, only the shared purpose of protecting the land. She found herself studying him in brief, fleeting moments, how his hands gripped the reins with both gentleness and authority, how his eyes never wavered from the task at hand, how his calm in the face of nature's rage mirrored the courage she had always prided herself on possessing. A bond was forming, silent but undeniable, forged in mud, wind, and rain, strengthened by the shared defiance against forces far larger than themselves. Each time lightning illuminated the valley, she caught glimpses of his expression, focused, unyielding, yet touched with a quiet awareness that somehow reassured her in the heart of the storm. At one point, their path brought them to a narrow ledge overlooking the river that sliced through the valley floor. Swollen and furious from the relentless downpour, stakes had been driven along the riverbank, threatening to carve away yet another portion of her land, and Alara realized that the crews had underestimated the fury of the storm as badly as they had underestimated her. Together, she and the warrior dismounted, slipping carefully along the treacherous edge to dismantle the stakes, the mud threatening to pull them into the roaring waters below. He moved beside her with a quiet steadiness, hands sure and strong, guiding her when the footing shifted unexpectedly, saving her from countless near falls without ever letting her feel helpless. And though they spoke little, the silence between them was not empty. It carried a resonance of trust and unspoken respect, an acknowledgement that both had recognized the other's skill, courage, and unbreakable will. In the heart of the storm, surrounded by wind, rain, and danger, Alara felt a spark of hope, the first in many long hours that perhaps the land could be saved, perhaps her family's legacy could endure, and perhaps, in the presence of this warrior who had ridden through the tempest to stand beside her, she was not truly alone. The storm raged on as they worked tirelessly, but for the first time, the chaos of nature felt less like a threat and more like a crucible, testing their resolve and sharpening their instincts. Every stake pulled, every path blocked, every surveyor driven back by their clever maneuvering brought not just temporary victory, but a sense of mastery over the elements and the encroaching forces of greed. And as the day wore on, Alara realized that the warrior's presence had changed everything, not just the immediate struggle to defend her land, but the very way she perceived her own strength, courage, and the possibilities of alliance. Amid the storm's fury, a partnership had been forged, unspoken yet undeniable, built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the relentless will to protect what mattered most. And though the rain continued to lash at their faces, and the river roared beneath them with a ferocity that mirrored the intensity of their battle, a sense of hope began to emerge, fragile but persistent, like the first break of sunlight behind a bank of dark clouds, promising that even in the harshest of storms, there were those who would ride through the tempest to stand with her, to fight for her land and perhaps, in time, for something far more personal than the fields and hills that had defined her life. By late afternoon, the storm showed no signs of relenting, though the rain had slowed to a fierce drizzle, and the wind still cut through the canyon like the edge of a blade. The valley was transformed into a chaotic battlefield of mud, slick rocks, and rising waters, and the stakes that once marked her family's land now lay overturned, crushed or swept into the torrents of the river. Yet the surveyors, driven by stubborn greed and desperation, had not relented. They pressed forward, attempting to reclaim their lost ground despite the obvious peril. Ilara's heart pounded as she and the warrior spotted a group working dangerously close to a cliffside where the river surged with unnatural fury, the water frothing white as it carved its relentless path downstream. She urged her horse forward, but before she could reach them, the warrior moved with astonishing speed, guiding her to a safer vantage point, while signaling the surveyors to halt with a combination of hand gestures and commanding shouts that carried even over the roar of the storm. There was something mesmerizing about the way he commanded attention. Neither arrogance nor force, but a quiet authority born of skill, knowledge, and respect for the land itself. Even the most obstinate men hesitated, uncertain whether they were facing mortal danger or a force that seemed beyond comprehension. The river surged again, and one of the surveyors slipped on the slick bank, teetering dangerously over the edge. Alara gasped and moved instinctively to help, but the warrior was there in an instant, his strong hands gripping hers and steadying both the man and herself. In that brief contact, she felt not just strength, but a current of something unspoken, trust, safety, and a closeness that seemed impossible to define in the chaos of the storm. The surveyor scrambled back to solid ground, swearing under his breath, and the others finally began to retreat. realizing that the storm was no longer an obstacle they could dominate with sheer will. Ilara exhaled sharply, her chest heaving, and for a moment allowed herself to feel a flicker of triumph, though it was tempered by exhaustion and the unrelenting rain. Her hands were raw from gripping the reins and the mud, her clothes soaked through, and every muscle in her body ached from the tension and the constant maneuvering over perilous terrain. Yet the warrior stood beside her, calm, steady, and seemingly untouched by the physical toll, a pillar of resolve that both grounded and inspired her. As they paused to survey the valley, the wind tugged at her damp hair, and lightning flashed across the sky, revealing the vast stretch of her reclaimed land in stark, brilliant relief. The stakes had been driven back, the river's banks had resisted intrusion, and the crews had retreated in the face of a combined force they could neither predict nor counter. Ilara's eyes met the warriors, and in that shared glance, a multitude of emotions passed between them. Exhaustion, relief, pride, and something deeper. An acknowledgement of the connection that had grown between them in the crucible of storm and danger. Words were unnecessary. The silence spoke volumes, filled with the understanding that they had both risked everything and that their partnership, born of necessity, had become something more profound. Her pulse slowed slightly as she recognized that the presence of this man, so unyielding yet patient, so fierce yet gentle, had altered her perception of strength, courage, and trust, and that she no longer felt entirely alone in her struggle. The storm continued to rage around them, though now with a diminished intensity, as if it too recognized the stalemate. The temporary victory won through determination, skill, and unspoken alliance. Ilara's hands shook slightly, not just from exertion, but from the realization that her world had expanded beyond what she had believed possible. The warrior had not only saved her land, but had illuminated a path to courage and partnership she had never dared to imagine. She felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest, a fluttering that spoke of possibilities far beyond survival or land. A sense of intimacy born not of words but of shared trials, glances and the silent acknowledgement of reliance and respect. His eyes met hers again, dark and unwavering, and she saw in them a reflection of her own fierce resolve, tempered by patience and quiet understanding. It was as if the storm itself had conspired to bring them together, forging a connection as unpredictable and powerful as the winds that still howled through the canyon. In that moment, as the rain continued to fall and the river surged relentlessly below, Ilara allowed herself a fleeting recognition that this warrior was no longer merely an ally in battle. He had become a presence intertwined with her fate, a force that could match her courage, challenge her stubbornness, and perhaps, in time, ignite something far more tender yet equally fierce. She felt her pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the stirring of something she had long denied herself, the possibility of trust, of companionship, and of a bond that transcended the struggle for land and survival. The storm was far from over, yet in the heart of its chaos a fragile, electric hope had been planted, promising that even in the face of relentless adversity, there existed the potential for partnership, understanding, and perhaps a connection that neither she nor the warrior could have anticipated when they first met on that windswept ridge. As twilight began to creep over the canyon, casting long shadows that danced across the sodden land, the storm finally began to abate, leaving the valley dripping and glistening under the fading light, a battlefield transformed into a testament of resilience. Ilara and the Apache warrior rode slowly along the ridges, surveying the aftermath of their relentless efforts. The stakes that had once threatened to scar her land, now dismantled or carried away by the swollen river. The crews having fled, cowed, by both the storm and the force of two determined defenders who had refused to yield. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, rain-soaked pine, and ozone from the fading lightning, a mixture that carried both the exhaustion of struggle and the quiet promise of renewal. Ilara's muscles ached, her clothes clung uncomfortably to her drenched skin, and her hands were raw from gripping the reins and helping to topple stakes. Yet a profound sense of accomplishment and relief coursed through her, mingling with a fragile, unfamiliar warmth that had taken root in the hours of shared peril. She glanced at the warrior riding beside her, his eyes scanning the horizon, dark and steady, his expression unyielding yet softened by the storm's passing, and she felt an ache in her chest that was no longer tied solely to the land. He had ridden through the tempest not just to stand beside her in battle, but to prove that some connections were forged in extremes, tempered by courage, resilience, and shared struggle. As they descended into the lower canyon, where the river's roar had begun to soften and the first patches of sky appeared in the dissipating clouds, Alara felt the weight of solitude that had clung to her for so long finally begin to lift. The warrior turned his gaze toward her, the corner of his lips lifting in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. And for the first time, she saw not just the fierce protector who had guided her through danger, but a man capable of warmth, understanding, and connection. Her own lips curved in response, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them, a bond born of necessity, but now carrying the potential for something far deeper, something that transcended the immediate struggle for land or survival. The valley, glistening under the remnants of the storm, seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing the fragile equilibrium achieved not only through defiance and courage, but through the emergence of trust and shared purpose. They rode together, in silence for a time, the soft splashes of their horses' hooves against the wet earth filling the spaces between unspoken words. Alara felt a sense of awe and gratitude she could not fully articulate, a recognition that the warrior had become more than a partner in defense. He had become a mirror reflecting her own courage, a presence that amplified her strength while softening the edges of her relentless independence. She remembered the solitude that had defined her life, the hours spent riding alone, scouting the land, fighting against forces that seemed insurmountable, and realized with clarity that she had been given not just protection, but the gift of companionship, someone who could match her intensity, understand her fears, and share the triumphs of both land and spirit. The storm, now reduced to distant rumbles and the occasional drizzle, seemed to serve as a final chorus to the ordeal, its fury spent yet leaving behind a landscape that, like them, had been tested and endured. Finally, as the canyon opened to the familiar stretches of her family's property, bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun, Alara dismounted, her legs trembling from exhaustion, but her spirit soaring. The warrior followed, landing beside her with a grace that belied the hours of struggle, and without a word, he extended a hand to steady her. When their fingers met, she felt an electric warmth, the culmination of hours of trust, danger, and unspoken understanding, and she knew that this moment was not merely about victory over the railroad or survival in the storm. It was about connection, about two souls meeting in a crucible that demanded courage, resilience, and openness to the unexpected. She looked up at him, at the dark intensity of his gaze softened by the faintest hint of admiration, and allowed herself the smallest, unguarded smile. He nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared, the battles fought, and the promise of what might come next. As night fell and the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, Alara stood on her land, the storm a fading memory, and for the first time in her life, she felt the full measure of triumph, not just over the forces that threatened her property, but over the loneliness and isolation that had shaped her days. She turned to the warrior whose presence had been as unyielding as the storm itself, and realized that the fight for land had revealed a far more profound truth, that courage was magnified by trust, that strength was deepened by companionship, and that the fiercest battles often led to the most unexpected connections. He offered her a quiet smile, and in that moment, surrounded by the damp earth, the whispering wind, and the starlit canyon, Alara understood that this was not the end of the story but the beginning of another, one where land, heart, and destiny, intertwined, forged in the storm and bound together by the courage to face the world not alone but together.